The knife was already at her throat when Alira realized the carriage had stopped moving. She did not scream. Screaming would have been the old Alira, the one who hid behind curtains and let her sister answer for her. This Alira, the one wearing her sister's name and her sister's wedding dress, forced her hands to stay still in her lap while a stranger's blade pressed against her skin, and a voice she did not recognize whispered that the real bride was supposed to be alone. "I am alone," she said, and her voice did not shake, though everything inside her did. The man behind her laughed, low and unimpressed. The guards outside say different. Outside, she could hear boots on gravel, at least 6 pairs, moving in a slow circle around the carriage like wolves closing on something wounded. Which was fitting, she thought, because that was exactly what they all were. Wolves. Every soldier in Chaol Draven's territory was a wolf first and a man second, and the woman who had agreed to marry their king was about to be a corpse in a stolen dress before she ever reached the palace gates. 3 days earlier, she had been standing in her sister's room, watching Sarah cry into a pillow because the letter from the Alpha King's court had arrived, with a red wax seal and a date circled twice. "I can't marry him," Sarah had said, over and over, the words worn smooth from repetition. "I can't, Alira, I can't. You don't understand. There's someone else. There's already someone else. And if they find out before the wedding, they'll kill him for touching what belongs to the throne. And if they find out after, they'll kill us both." Alira had understood perfectly. She always understood Sarah better than Sarah understood herself. A side effect of 18 years spent as the quiet twin, the spare twin, the one people forgot to look at when Sarah was in the room. She had grown so used to being invisible that when the idea came to her, it arrived less like a plan, and more like a fact she was simply remembering. "Then I'll go," she had said. Sarah had stopped crying long enough to stare at her like she'd grown a second head. "You can't. He'll know." "Nobody has ever known," Alira had said. "Not our own mother, half the time." It was true. They had spent their whole childhood swapping places for exams, for chores, for punishments neither of them deserved, and not once had anyone caught them. A king who had never laid eyes on either of them was not going to be the exception. That was what she had told herself in the carriage on the way to the border, and what she had told herself every hour since, and it was still what she told herself now, with a blade at her throat and her sister's name in her mouth like a stone she couldn't spit out. "Let her go," said a new voice, and everything changed at once. The carriage door was wrenched open so hard it nearly came off its hinges, and the man holding the knife made a sound like the air had left his body. Before Alira understood, he had been pulled backward and off the seat entirely. She caught one glimpse of gold eyes and dark hair before her attacker was gone, thrown into the mud outside like a piece of luggage, and a second man filled the doorway in his place. He was not what she expected a king to look like. There was no crown, no fine gold thread. Nothing but a plain black coat with the sleeves shoved up to the elbow and forearms that looked like they had done more fighting than ruling. His eyes found her immediately and did not move. "Are you hurt?" he said. It was not really a question. It was closer to an order, demanding an answer be true. "No," she managed. He looked at her for one more second, the kind of look that seemed to catalog every detail of her face and store it somewhere for later use. And then he turned away from her entirely, stepping back out into the night, as though she had already stopped being interesting. Outside, someone was screaming, short and final, and then nothing. When he returned to the doorway, there was blood on his knuckles that had not been there a moment before, and he did not seem to notice it at all. "You're the Voss bride," he said. Not a question. Alira swallowed the fear still sitting thick in her throat and nodded, because this was the moment. This was the first test, and if she failed it now, none of the last 3 days would matter. "I am," she said, and the lie came out steadier than she thought it would. 6 men tried to kill you tonight," he said. "I want to know why, before I want to know anything else about you. Do you understand?" "I don't know why," she said, and that part at least was true. He studied her for a long moment, the kind of silence that felt like it had weight, like it could press a person flat if it went on long enough. Then he stepped back from the door and extended one bloodied hand toward her. "Chaol Draven," he said. "You may as well learn my name before you learn to hate it." She did not take his hand right away. Some small, stubborn part of her, the part that had spent 18 years being quiet and careful and unnoticed, wanted to sit in the ruined carriage a moment longer and simply breathe. But the moment passed, as moments do, and she reached out and let him pull her down onto solid ground, her legs unsteady beneath her, the smell of blood and pine and something like storm air clinging to him in a way she would remember long after she wanted to forget it. The camp they made for the night was nothing like the palace she had imagined. No banners, no fine tents, just soldiers arranging themselves in a loose ring around a fire, while their king paced the edge of it like the danger might return if he stopped moving. Elira sat wrapped in a borrowed cloak that smelled of horse and wood smoke, watching him from across the flames, and tried to understand what kind of man ended 6 lives without breaking stride, and then forgot the blood was even on his hands. "You're staring," said a woman's voice beside her, and Elira turned to find a soldier settling down next to her, dark-skinned and sharp-eyed, with a long scar along one cheekbone that looked deliberate rather than accidental. "I'm trying to understand him," Elira admitted, because there seemed to be no point lying to someone who clearly already knew more than she did. "Nobody understands him," the soldier said. Her name, she offered a moment later, was Nora, and she had served the king for 6 years, long enough to know things she probably wasn't supposed to say to a stranger wearing a wedding dress in the mud. "He doesn't let people close enough to understand him. Ask anyone in the court. Ask his own advisors. He rules like the throne is a debt he's paying off, not a gift he was given." "Why would anyone want him dead tonight?" Elira asked. "Before the wedding even happens." Nora's expression shifted, something careful sliding over her face like a shutter closing. "Ask him," she said, which was really no answer at all, and then she stood and walked away before Elira could press further. Elira did not sleep that night, not truly. She lay on a bedroll near the fire, and watched the dark shapes of soldiers taking turns at watch, and thought about the letter still folded inside her bag, the one Sarah had written in case anything went wrong, the one that explained everything and asked for forgiveness, and would end both their lives if anyone ever found it. She thought about the man across the fire who had killed 6 people without changing his expression, and then looked at her like she was the only fragile thing in a very dangerous world. She thought, finally, about home, about her mother's kitchen, and the particular way morning light fell through the window there, and let herself miss it in a way she had not allowed herself to since climbing into the carriage 3 days ago. By morning, the fear had settled into something quieter, something she could work with. Fear that lived in the chest instead of the throat. She rose before most of the camp, watched the soldiers break down their small camp with the kind of practiced efficiency that came from doing it 100 times before, and found herself standing near the king without quite meaning to. "You didn't sleep," he said, without looking at her. "Neither did you," she said, before she could stop herself. That earned her the smallest flicker of something at the corner of his mouth, gone before she could decide what to call it. "No," he agreed. "I don't, often. It's a poor habit for a king to have. Gives the advisors too much time to worry about me." "Do they worry about you?" she asked, thinking of Nora's careful, closed expression the night before. "They worry about the throne," he said. "I am simply the thing currently sitting on it." They rode the rest of the way to the palace in near silence, Elira on a borrowed horse beside him, rather than shut inside another carriage, which she suspected was less about comfort and more about him wanting to keep an eye on the woman 6 strangers had tried to kill the night before. She used the hours to watch him instead, the way he held himself in the saddle, easy and alert at once, the way soldiers around him seemed to relax slightly whenever he was near, rather than tense, which was the opposite of what she expected from a king people called ruthless behind closed doors. The palace itself rose out of the northern hills like something carved rather than built, gray stone against gray sky, banners the color of dried blood snapping in a wind that smelled like coming snow. Elira felt her stomach fold in on itself at the sight of it, the sheer scale of the lie she was about to walk into. But she kept her spine straight and her chin level, because that was what Sarah would have done, and for the next however many days or months or years, she needed to be Sarah in every way that mattered. At the gates, an older man in fine gray robes waited with an expression that suggested he had already decided to dislike whatever walked through them. His eyes moved over Elira with a kind of clinical thoroughness that made her want to shrink, an old familiar instinct she forced herself to override. "This is Edmund Hale," Cale said, dismounting. "He handles matters of the court I find tedious. He will have questions for you. Answer them honestly, or don't answer them at all. I would rather have silence than lies in this house." The words landed in Elira's chest like a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading long after the stone itself had sunk. She smiled at Edmund Hale, and the smile felt like the hardest thing she had done since climbing into that carriage. "Of course," she said, "I have nothing to hide." It was, she thought, the first outright lie she had told since arriving, and she suspected, watching the flicker of something assessing cross Edmund Hale's face, that it would not be her last. The halls of the palace were colder than she expected, all stone and shadow, lit by torches that guttered in drafts she couldn't place the source of. Servants moved along the edges of rooms rather than through the centers, eyes down, voices low, and Alira understood within the first hour that this was not a house that welcomed warmth easily. She was given rooms in the east wing, 3 times the size of anything she had lived in before, with a window that looked out over training yards where soldiers moved through drills even in the gray afternoon light. She was still standing at that window, watching the soldiers below, when the door opened without a knock and Cale Draven stepped inside, as though the room already belonged to him, which, she supposed, it did. "There will be a dinner tonight," he said. "The full council will attend. They will want to look at you. Some of them will want to find fault with you. I would advise you to give them none." "I'll do my best," Alira said, and meant it more than he could possibly know. He studied her for a moment, the same cataloging look from the carriage the night before, and something in his expression shifted slightly. Curiosity layered over the wariness that seemed to be his default state with everyone. "You're not what the letters described," he said finally. Her heart stopped, just for a second, a full and complete stop before it lurched back into motion. "What do you mean?" "The reports from your family's house described a woman who rarely spoke, who stayed close to the walls of every room she entered." He tilted his head slightly. "You held a conversation with an assassin at your throat without your voice breaking once. That is not the woman I was told I was marrying." Alira forced herself to breathe, forced her expression to stay smooth, even as her mind raced through every possible answer that would not end with her exposed and Sarah condemned in her place. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "the reports were wrong. Or perhaps a knife at the throat changes a person rather quickly." He considered this, and for one terrible stretched moment, she thought she saw disbelief settle behind his eyes. Then, unexpectedly, something almost like a smile touched his mouth. "Perhaps," he said. "We'll find out which it is soon enough." He left without another word, and Alira sat down hard on the edge of the bed, her hands finally allowed to shake now that no one was watching. She had survived one night, one attack, one conversation with a man whose gold eyes seemed to see straight through fabric and flesh, to whatever truth lay underneath. She did not know how many more nights like this she had in her, but she knew, with a certainty that settled cold and clear in her chest, that the dinner tonight would be only the beginning of a much longer test, and that Cale Draven was not a man who stopped asking questions simply because the first answer sounded convincing. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, her sister was safe, hidden with the guard she loved, believing that Alira's sacrifice had bought them both a future. Alira intended to make sure that belief held true, whatever it cost her, whatever lies she had to keep building on top of the first one, whatever it meant to keep looking into those gold eyes and pretending she was someone she had never been. She had no way of knowing, as she dressed for dinner in a gown that had been Sarah's and not her own, that the man she was lying to had already begun to suspect the truth, and that his suspicion, rather than turning to anger, was slowly and dangerously turning into something else entirely. The dining hall held 12 people and felt, to Alira, like it held 12 knives instead, all of them aimed loosely in her direction and waiting for an excuse to draw closer. She had expected the council to be old men in heavy robes, the kind of faces that belonged in portraits rather than conversations, and some of them were exactly that. But there were younger faces too, sharp and watchful, and one woman near the head of the table whose eyes tracked Alira's every movement with an intensity that made the back of her neck prickle. She learned later that this was Lady Rowan, keeper of the Northern Treaties, and that she had opposed the marriage from the very beginning, on the grounds that a minor house like the Voss family brought nothing of value to a kingdom already strong enough to stand without allies. "Tell us," Lady Rowan said, halfway through the second course, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry down the table without seeming to shout. "How does a woman survive 6 trained assassins with nothing but the clothes on her back?" The table went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when everyone already knows the answer is dangerous. Alira set down her fork with deliberate care, buying herself half a second to choose her words. "I didn't survive them," she said. "Your king did. I simply didn't die before he arrived." A ripple of something moved through the table. Not quite laughter, but close to it, the tension breaking just slightly. Alira caught Cale watching her from the head of the table, his expression unreadable, though something in the set of his shoulders had eased. "Modest," Lady Rowan said, in a tone that suggested she found the modesty suspicious rather than charming. "The reports from the Voss house described a woman who fainted at the sight of a training yard. Perhaps the reports were exaggerated." "Perhaps people change when their life is threatened," Alira said, echoing the same words she had used with Cale earlier that day, because they were the only true things she had to offer without giving away everything else. Lady Rowan's eyes narrowed slightly, but before she could press further, an older man with silver hair leaned forward and cleared his throat. This, Illyra would later learn, was General Colton, commander of the Northern Forces and one of the few people in the palace whose loyalty to Chaol seemed to run deeper than duty. "The attack itself concerns me more than the bride's composure," Colton said, and the table's attention shifted gratefully away from Illyra and toward him, 6 trained men, moving as a single unit, striking at the exact moment the convoy crossed into our territory. "That is not the work of bandits. That took planning, and money, and knowledge of the wedding route that only a handful of people in this palace possessed. You're suggesting someone inside these walls arranged the attack," Chaol said. It wasn't a question. His voice had gone flat and cold, the same tone Illyra imagined he must have used the night before, right before 6 men stopped breathing. "I'm suggesting it's worth considering," Colton said carefully. The rest of the dinner passed in a tension Illyra could feel pressing against her skin, conversations that skirted the edges of accusation without ever landing directly on anyone. She said little, ate less, and spent most of the meal cataloging faces and names the way she imagined a spy might, though she had no experience being one, and was inventing the skill as she went. Afterward, walking the long corridor back toward her rooms, she found Chaol falling into step beside her, his boots silent against the stone in a way that unsettled her slightly, as though he had trained his own body not to announce itself. "You handled Lady Rowan well," he said. "She doesn't like me." "She doesn't like anyone," Chaol said. "It has nothing to do with you personally. She distrusts every alliance that doesn't strengthen the throne on paper, and a marriage to a minor house looks, to her, like weakness dressed up as diplomacy." "And what does it look like to you?" Illyra asked, and immediately wondered if she had overstepped, if the question was too pointed, too curious for a bride who was supposed to already know her place in this arrangement. But Chaol only considered it, slowing his pace slightly as they walked. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "I agreed to this marriage because the treaty required it, and because I was told the Voss family's youngest daughter was quiet, unremarkable, easy to place in a role and forget about. I find myself reconsidering that description rather often since you arrived." Illyra's pulse quickened in a way that had nothing to do with fear this time, and everything to do with the particular danger of being seen too closely by a man she was actively deceiving. "People are rarely as simple as the reports describe them," she said. "No," Chaol agreed. "They rarely are." They reached her door, and he paused there longer than seemed necessary, his gold eyes moving over her face with that same cataloging attention from before, as though he were memorizing something, or perhaps searching for something he expected to find and hadn't yet. "There will be a hunt tomorrow," he said finally. "A tradition before any formal joining of houses. You'll be expected to attend, though not to participate directly. Stay close to Nora. She'll keep you informed of what's expected." "I understand," Illyra said. He nodded once, turned, and walked away down the corridor, leaving her standing at her own door with her heart doing something complicated and unwelcome in her chest. She let herself into the room, closed the door, and pressed her back against it, breathing out slowly. This was supposed to be simple, she reminded herself. Wear her sister's name, survive the marriage, keep Sarah safe, disappear into the quiet, forgotten corners of palace life the way she had always disappeared into the corners of every room she'd ever stood in. She had not accounted for a king who looked at her like she was worth cataloging, worth remembering, worth reconsidering entire reports over. She had not accounted for the particular danger of being seen. The hunt the next morning began before the sun had fully cleared the eastern hills, a long line of riders moving out from the palace gates into forest thick with frost. Illyra rode near the back of the group, as instructed, with Nora close beside her offering quiet commentary on which lords held which loyalties and which advisors were worth avoiding entirely. "Watch General Colton," Nora said at one point, her voice pitched low enough that only Illyra could hear it over the sound of hooves and harness. "He's loyal to Chaol more than anyone else at that table, but loyalty makes people protective, and protective people do foolish things when they think a threat is close." "Does he think I'm a threat?" Illyra asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "He thinks everyone is a threat until proven otherwise," Nora said. "It's why he's survived as long as he has." The hunt itself moved deeper into the forest as the morning wore on, the pace quickening as scouts reported signs of a large stag ahead. Illyra found herself falling slightly behind the main group, her borrowed horse less accustomed to the terrain than the others, and it was in that gap, that small space between herself and the rest of the party, that she heard the first crack of a branch behind her that did not belong to any deer. She turned in the saddle just in time to see a shape moving low and fast through the underbrush, wrong in a way she couldn't immediately name, and then Nora was shouting something behind her, a warning that came half a second too late, as the shape burst from the tree line directly into the path of Alira's horse. The horse reared, screaming, and Alira felt herself losing the saddle entirely, the world tilting sideways in that long, stretched moment before impact. And then arms were around her, solid and sudden, pulling her clear of the horse's flailing hooves and into the cold, hard ground instead. A fall that should have hurt far more than it did because someone had taken the worst of it. She opened her eyes to find Cale beneath her, having apparently thrown himself from his own horse to catch her mid-fall, his arms still locked around her, his breathing ragged in a way that had nothing to do with exertion and everything to do with something closer to fear. "Are you hurt?" he said, the exact words from the carriage 2 nights before, the same order disguised as a question. "No," she managed, though her heart was slamming against her ribs so hard she wondered if he could feel it through the layers of fabric between them. What was that? What attacked the horse? Behind them, soldiers had already surrounded the shape in the underbrush, and Alira twisted to see General Colton standing over the still form of an enormous wolf, its fur matted with something dark that was not mud. "That," Cale said grimly, helping her to her feet, "was not a wild animal. Wild wolves do not attack armed hunting parties in broad daylight. Wild wolves do not have collars hidden beneath their fur." He held up a small strip of leather, cut free from the dead animal's neck, a collar meant to be invisible beneath thick winter fur. "Someone sent it," Alira said quietly. "Someone sent it," Cale agreed, and his voice had gone cold again, the same flat, dangerous tone from the dinner the night before. "And it did not attack randomly. It went directly for your horse, out of every rider in this party." The rest of the hunting party gathered slowly around them, murmurs spreading through the group as word passed from person to person, and Alira felt the weight of every eye in the clearing settling onto her. Curious, suspicious, afraid. Lady Rowan, she noticed, was not among those looking frightened. Her expression was something closer to calculation, watching Alira with an intensity that made the cold morning air feel colder still. "We return to the palace," Cale announced, his voice carrying easily across the clearing. "Immediately. Double the guard on the east wing tonight." The ride back was silent, tense, every rider glancing at the tree line as though it might produce another threat at any moment. Alira kept her eyes forward, her hands steady on the reins despite the tremor she could feel building somewhere beneath her ribs, and tried to make sense of the fact that twice now, in less than 3 days, something had tried very hard to kill the woman wearing her sister's name. It occurred to her, somewhere on that long ride home, that whoever was trying to kill Sarah Voss had no idea they were actually trying to kill someone else entirely, and that realization brought with it a strange, twisted kind of relief, followed almost immediately by a colder, sharper fear. If the danger was aimed at Sarah specifically, at the real bride and whatever secret history the real bride carried, then Alira was standing directly in the path of a threat meant for someone who wasn't even in the building. She needed to understand why, and she was beginning to suspect that the only way to understand why was to get closer to the very man she was most desperate to keep at a distance. That evening, Cale found her again, this time in the small library adjoining her rooms, where she had gone to escape the oppressive quiet of her own chambers, and the memory of arms catching her mid-fall. "You're not eating," he observed, nodding toward the untouched tray a servant had left earlier. "I'm not hungry." "You're frightened," he corrected, settling into the chair across from her without invitation. "That's a reasonable response to what happened today." "Are you frightened?" she asked, before she could stop herself, and immediately regretted the question, too personal, too pointed for the careful distance she was supposed to be maintaining. But he only considered it seriously, the way he seemed to consider most things, weighing the question before answering. "I am concerned," he said finally. "There is a difference. Fear clouds judgment. Concern sharpens it. I intend to find whoever sent that wolf, and whoever hired the men who attacked your carriage, and I intend to understand why both attacks were aimed so precisely at you rather than at me, which would be the more obvious target for anyone wishing to disrupt this alliance." Alira's stomach twisted. Perhaps they simply saw an easier opportunity. "Perhaps," Cale said, though his tone made it clear he did not believe that for a moment. "Or perhaps there is something about you specifically, that someone very badly does not want to become my wife." The words landed too close to the truth for comfort, and Alira had to look away, pretending sudden interest in the fire, rather than let him see whatever expression crossed her face in that moment. "I have no enemies," she said quietly. "I've lived a small life. I don't understand why anyone would want me dead." It was, in its own strange way, entirely true. Alira Voss had no enemies. It was Sarah Voss whose secrets might be worth killing over, and Alira had no idea, not yet, what those secrets truly were. Then we will find out together, Cale said, and something in the quiet certainty of his voice made Alira's chest ache in a way she did not have a name for yet, a feeling tangled somewhere between gratitude and guilt, and a third thing she refused to examine too closely. He left not long after, and Alira sat alone in the library long into the night, watching the fire burn down to embers, turning over every piece of the last 3 days like stones in her palm, searching for the shape of a truth she could not yet see clearly. Somewhere in the palace, she was certain, someone knew exactly why Sarah Voss needed to die before the wedding could be completed, and Alira, wearing her sister's name and standing directly in the path of that danger, intended to find out who, before the next attempt succeeded where the first two had failed. 3 days passed without another attack, and the quiet unsettled Alira more than the danger itself had. She spent the mornings with Nora, learning the layout of the palace room by room, learning which servants could be trusted with small questions and which ones reported everything they heard straight back to Lady Rowan. She spent the afternoons in the library, poring over old treaty documents Cale had left for her under the guise of preparing her for her role as queen, though she suspected, from the careful way certain pages were left open, that he was also testing what she already knew and what she didn't. "You read faster than anyone I've met," he said one afternoon, finding her deep in a stack of border agreements from decades before either of them had been born. "I had a lot of quiet years to fill," she said, which was true in a way he couldn't fully understand. He sat across from her, close enough that she could smell the same faint scent of pine and cold air that seemed to follow him everywhere, and picked up one of the documents she had already set aside. "Tell me what you think of this one." It was a grazing rights dispute between two border villages, decades old, technically resolved but still generating quiet resentment on both sides according to the margin notes some previous advisor had scrawled years ago. Alira studied it for a moment before answering. "I think whoever resolved this gave the appearance of fairness without actually fixing anything," she said slowly. "Both villages lost something, so both villages felt equally wronged, which looks balanced on paper but leaves two populations who each believe they were cheated. A better solution would have given something back to both sides instead of taking from both sides equally." Cale was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression she was coming to recognize, the same cataloging look from their first meeting, except softer now, less suspicious and more genuinely curious. "That is precisely what I thought when I read it," he said, "though I've never heard anyone else voice it that plainly. Perhaps no one else read it as carefully." "Perhaps," he agreed, though his tone suggested he was filing the observation away for later use, the way he seemed to file away every small surprising thing about her. These moments, Alira noticed, were becoming more frequent and more dangerous. Not the danger of assassins in the forest, but a slower, quieter danger, the kind that crept in through shared silences and easy conversation and the particular way Cale's expression shifted whenever she said something he hadn't expected. She found herself looking forward to these afternoons in the library in a way she hadn't anticipated, and that, more than any wolf or hidden blade, frightened her most of all. It was General Colton who brought the next piece of the puzzle to light, arriving at the library one evening with a folded piece of parchment, held carefully by its edges, as though it might bite him. "We found this," he said, addressing Cale directly, though his eyes flicked toward Alira with an expression she couldn't quite read, "among the belongings of one of the men who attacked the carriage. It survived the fighting better than the man carrying it did." Cale took the parchment, unfolding it slowly, and Alira watched his expression darken as he read whatever was written there. When he finally looked up, his gold eyes found hers with an intensity that made her stomach drop. "This is a payment record," he said, "for the attack on the carriage. It doesn't name who arranged it, but it does name the target." He paused, and the pause stretched long enough that Alira felt the silence pressing against her ribs. "It says the target is Sarah Voss, specifically described as the youngest daughter of the Voss house, engaged to marry the Alpha King. It doesn't simply say kill the bride, it names you directly, by name and by description, as though whoever arranged this needed to be certain the correct woman was killed." Alira's mouth had gone dry. "What does that mean?" "It means," Colton said slowly, "that this was never about disrupting the alliance in general. This was about ensuring one specific woman never became queen, which raises the question of what that specific woman might know, or have done or represent, that made her death worth this much planning and money." The room felt suddenly very small. Alira was aware of Cale watching her, aware of Colton watching her, aware of her own pulse hammering loud enough that she wondered if wolves could hear heartbeats the way stories claimed. She thought of Sarah, hidden away somewhere with the guard she loved, believing this danger had followed the wedding rather than followed her specifically. She thought of the letter still tucked inside her bag, the one that would explain everything and destroy everything in the same breath. "I don't know what I could have done to earn this," she said, and her voice came out smaller than she intended, genuine fear bleeding through despite her best efforts to stay composed. "I've lived a quiet life. I don't have enemies who would pay to have me killed." "Then perhaps," Cale said, his voice gentler than she expected, "the enemy isn't yours at all. Perhaps it belongs to someone close to you. Family, old friends. Someone whose secrets could be mistaken for yours, or whose danger followed you here by accident rather than intention." The observation landed too close to the truth for comfort, close enough that Alira had to look away to keep her expression from giving anything away. It was, in its own twisted way, exactly right, and exactly wrong at the same time, and she had no way to explain the difference without unraveling everything. "I can't think of anyone," she said quietly, which was, at least, technically true. She could think of exactly one person, and she would not name her, not to save herself, not even under the weight of Cale's careful, searching gaze. Colton left not long after, taking the parchment with him to be studied further by the palace's small collection of scholars and codebreakers, and Alira found herself alone with Cale in the fading evening light, the fire in the library grate throwing long shadows across the stacks of old documents between them. "You're hiding something," Cale said quietly, and it was not an accusation exactly, more an observation offered gently, the way one might point out a bruise rather than the wound that caused it. Alira's heart stopped for the length of a breath. "What makes you say that?" "Instinct," he said. "I've spent my whole life reading people who want something from me, and you read differently than anyone I've dealt with. Not dishonest, exactly, but careful, guarded, as though every word you speak has been chosen from a much larger pool of words you've decided not to say." She forced herself to meet his eyes, forced her voice to stay level. "Everyone has things they don't say, Cale. That doesn't make them liars." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't. But it does make me curious what you're protecting, and curious enough that I intend to keep asking until I understand it fully." The words should have frightened her more than they did. Instead, something in his tone, quiet and patient rather than threatening, made her chest ache with a feeling she refused to name. She was lying to this man in the most fundamental way a person could lie to another, wearing a stolen name, sleeping in a stolen bed, answering to a title that belonged to her sister and not to her, and yet some small, foolish part of her wanted, more than anything, to simply tell him the truth and trust that he would understand. She did not tell him. Not that night, and not in the nights that followed, though the temptation grew heavier each time he looked at her the way he was looking at her now, like she was a puzzle worth solving rather than a problem to be managed. The formal announcement of the wedding date came a week later, delivered by Edmund Hale with the same clinical thoroughness he brought to everything. A date circled on a calendar that suddenly made the entire situation feel far more permanent than it had before. Alira stood in her rooms that evening, staring at her own reflection in a mirror too fine for the life she had actually lived, and tried to reconcile the woman staring back at her with the woman she had always believed herself to be. The quiet twin, the forgotten one, the girl who hid behind curtains while her sister filled every room with light. That girl would never have survived a knife at her throat without her voice breaking. That girl would never have caught the eye of a king who catalogued every detail of her face like something worth remembering. Somewhere in the last week, without quite noticing it happening, Alira had begun to become someone else entirely, someone sharper and steadier, and far more dangerous than she had ever believed herself capable of being. She did not know yet whether that transformation would save her, or destroy her, or simply make the eventual unraveling of her lie that much more painful for everyone involved. But she knew, standing in front of that mirror with the wedding date circled somewhere in Edmund Hale's careful ledger, that there was no path back to the quiet life she had left behind. Whatever came next, she would face it as the woman she had become in this palace, not the girl who had climbed into that carriage 3 weeks before. A knock came at her door as the last light faded from the sky, and she opened it to find Nora standing there, her expression tighter than usual, a folded note held carefully in one hand. "This came for you," Nora said. "Through the kitchens. A servant said a traveler left it, paid to make sure it reached you directly and no one else." Alira's hands trembled slightly as she took the note, some instinct already warning her before she broke the seal, and when she unfolded the paper and read the single line written there, her blood went cold in a way no assassin's blade had managed to achieve. The note read simply, "I know who you really are. Meet me at the eastern gate at midnight, or I tell the king myself." There was no signature. There didn't need to be one. Alira stood frozen in her doorway, the paper shaking slightly in her grip, and understood, with a clarity that settled like ice in her chest, that the quiet week of careful conversations and growing trust had come to an end, and that whatever waited for her at the eastern gate at midnight would determine everything that followed. Elira told no one about the note. She considered it, standing in her room with the paper still trembling in her hand, considered walking straight to Cale and laying the whole truth at his feet before some stranger at the eastern gate could do it for her. But telling him meant ending everything on her own terms rather than someone else's, and some stubborn, frightened part of her wasn't ready to let go of the choice just yet. If she could learn who had sent the note, who knew her secret, she might still find a way to protect Sarah before the truth came out at all. She waited until the palace settled into its late hours, until the corridors emptied of servants and the only sounds left were the distant calls of soldiers on watch, and then she wrapped herself in a dark cloak and made her way toward the eastern gate, with her heart hammering hard enough that she was certain someone would hear it before they saw her. The gate stood at the edge of the palace grounds, half lit by a single lantern hung from an iron hook, and beyond it the forest stretched dark and silent toward the hills. A figure waited near the lantern, hood drawn up against the cold, and Elira's steps slowed as she approached, every instinct screaming at her to turn back. "You came alone," the figure said, and the voice, low and rasping, belonged to a man she didn't recognize. "You said you'd tell the king," Elira said, keeping her own voice steady, with an effort that cost her more than she wanted to admit. "I'd like to know why you haven't already." The man laughed, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Because dead women can't pay debts, and I'm not interested in your death, only in your coin. Someone paid good money to see the real bride dead before this wedding happens. I know you're not her. I've seen the real Sarah Voss before, years ago, at a market fair in the southern provinces. You have her face, but you don't have her walk, or her voice, or the particular way she used to laugh at nothing at all. Whoever taught you to wear her name taught you well, but not well enough to fool someone who actually knew her." Elira's stomach dropped, ice spreading through her chest even as she forced her expression to stay flat, unreadable. "You're mistaken." "I'm not," the man said, stepping closer, close enough that the lantern light caught the edge of a scarred jaw beneath his hood. "And it doesn't matter whether you admit it or not. What matters is what you're willing to pay to keep me quiet. I know a man was hired to end the real Sarah Voss before this marriage could be completed. I don't know why, and frankly I don't care why. But I know you're not her, and I know the king would care very much to learn that his bride is a lie wearing a dead woman's dress, considering that the woman he actually contracted to marry is likely already dead somewhere, replaced by her own sister." The words hit Elira like a physical blow, and for one terrible moment her carefully built composure cracked entirely. "Sarah isn't dead," she said, too quickly, too much emotion bleeding into the words before she could stop them. The man went very still. "So there is a sister," he said softly, almost delighted. "That's more than I actually knew for certain. Thank you for confirming it." Elira understood, in that instant, exactly how badly she had misjudged the entire conversation. He had been guessing, testing, and she had handed him confirmation without meaning to, the way a cornered animal sometimes gives away exactly the information it means to protect. "What do you want?" she said, forcing the fear back down where it belonged, letting something colder and more practical take its place. "Gold," the man said simply. "Enough of it, paid quietly, and I disappear back into whatever hole I crawled out of. You'll have plenty of access to the treasury soon enough, once you're queen. It shouldn't be difficult for a clever woman like yourself to arrange. And if I refuse, then I walk straight to the king's advisors tomorrow morning and tell them everything I've guessed tonight, and let them draw their own conclusions about where the real Sarah Voss has gone, and why her sister found it necessary to take her place." Elira's mind raced, calculating possibilities faster than she had ever calculated anything in her life. She could pay him, buy herself time, though she had no idea how she would gather that kind of money without drawing attention to herself. She could refuse and hope Cale's protection extended even to a lie this large, though she had no evidence that it would. Or she could do something far more dangerous, something that terrified her even as the idea formed. "I need time," she said. "A week. I can't simply produce gold from nothing, not without someone noticing." The man considered this, his scarred jaw working slightly beneath the hood. 3 days, he said finally. "And don't consider bringing guards to this gate a second time, or I'll make certain the entire court hears everything before you can silence me." He melted back into the darkness before she could say anything else, leaving her alone at the gate with the lantern guttering weakly against the cold, and Elira stood there for a long moment, shaking, trying to gather herself enough to walk back inside without collapsing entirely. She did not make it far. "You lied to me about where you were going tonight," said a voice from the shadows near the wall, and Alira's heart nearly stopped as Cale stepped into the lantern light, his expression unreadable in the dim glow, his gold eyes fixed on her, with an intensity that made her knees weak, in an entirely different way than fear usually did. "Cale," she said, and her voice cracked slightly on his name. "I followed you," he said simply. "I've had guards watching the perimeter since the wolf attack. When one of them reported a woman leaving the East Wing alone after midnight, I came myself rather than send someone else." He paused, and something in his expression shifted, hardened slightly. I heard enough of that conversation to understand it was not a simple meeting between strangers. Alira felt the ground shift beneath her, the careful architecture of her lie collapsing faster than she could rebuild it. "Cale, please, let me explain. Is your name Sarah?" he asked, and the question was flat, quiet, devastating in its simplicity. The silence that followed felt endless. Alira opened her mouth to answer, to construct some new lie that might hold the collapsing structure together a little longer, and found, for the first time since climbing into that carriage weeks ago, that she could not force the lie past her lips. "No," she said finally, the words small and final in the cold night air. "My name is Alira. Sarah is my sister, my twin." Cale did not move, did not speak, simply stood there absorbing the confirmation of something he had clearly already suspected, and the silence stretched long enough that Alira felt her whole body go cold with a fear that had nothing to do with assassins or blackmail, and everything to do with the particular way he was looking at her now, like a stranger rather than the woman he had spent the last weeks slowly beginning to trust. "Why?" he said finally, and the single word carried more weight than any accusation could have. "Sarah couldn't marry you," Alira said, the truth spilling out now that the first crack had opened, unable to stop the flow once it started. "She's already bonded to someone else, someone she can never claim publicly, and if the truth came out before the wedding, they would have killed her for breaking the betrothal, and killed him for touching what belonged to the throne. I offered to take her place because I couldn't watch her die for loving the wrong person. I never meant for anyone else to be hurt by it. I never meant to become someone you would." She stopped herself before the sentence finished, before she said something she couldn't take back. "Someone I would what?" Cale said quietly, stepping closer despite everything, despite the lie now laid bare between them. "Someone you would care about," Alira whispered, the confession costing her more than anything she had said all night. "I never meant for that to happen. I was supposed to be invisible. I was supposed to disappear into this role the way I've disappeared into every room I've ever stood in. And instead you kept looking at me like I was worth remembering, and I let myself believe, for a little while, that maybe I could be." Cale was silent for a long moment, his expression caught somewhere between anger and something far more complicated, and when he finally spoke his voice had lost its earlier hardness, replaced by something quieter, more uncertain than she had ever heard from him. "The blackmailer," he said, "he knows the truth. He'll tell the court by morning if you don't pay him, and if he does, the council will demand your death for impersonating a royal bride, whether I want to protect you or not." "I know," Alira said. "Then we don't have 3 days," Cale said, and something shifted in his expression, a decision hardening behind his gold eyes. "We have until sunrise to find him, and silence him before he tells anyone else what he suspects. Or this ends badly for both of us before either of us has a chance to decide what we actually want it to become." He extended his hand toward her, the same gesture from the ruined carriage weeks before, and Alira stared at it for a long moment, disbelief and gratitude and a fear she couldn't quite name all tangled together in her chest. "You still want to help me?" she said. "After everything I just told you. I want to understand what I'm actually feeling before I decide what to do about the lie underneath it," Cale said. "And I can't do that if you're dead by morning because a blackmailer decided silence was worth less than gossip. Come, we don't have much time." She took his hand, and together they moved back into the shadows of the palace grounds, chasing a stranger through the dark with 3 days shortened suddenly to a single desperate night, and Alira understood, with a clarity sharp enough to cut, that whatever came next would decide not only her fate, but the fate of everyone she had ever tried to protect. They found the blackmailer's trail near the edge of the forest, a set of boot prints pressed deep into frost-hardened mud, leading away from the eastern gate, toward a cluster of abandoned hunting cabins the palace guard rarely patrolled. Cale moved through the dark with an ease that unsettled Alira even as it reassured her, his senses clearly attuned to details she couldn't perceive at all, pausing every so often to test the air like a man reading a message written in scent rather than ink. She followed close behind him, her borrowed cloak pulled tight against the cold, her mind still reeling from the confession she had just made and the strange, careful way he had chosen to respond to it. He's close, Kale murmured, slowing as they approached the first of the cabins, its windows dark, its door hanging slightly ajar despite the cold. But something's wrong. I smell blood. They found the blackmailer inside, slumped against the cabin's cold hearth, his throat opened in a single clean line that had ended his life quickly and without struggle. Alira pressed a hand to her mouth, horror and a strange, guilty relief tangling together in her chest, and Kale crouched beside the body, studying the wound with a grim, professional focus. This wasn't done by an amateur, he said. Whoever killed him knew exactly what they were doing, and did it quietly enough that no one in the surrounding cabins heard a struggle. He straightened, his expression darkening further, which means whoever hired the original assassins, and whoever sent that wolf, is still here, still watching, and just silenced the one man who could have connected your secret to the wider conspiracy against Sarah Voss's life. They killed him to protect their own plan, Alira said slowly, understanding dawning cold and sharp, not to protect me. Precisely, Kale said, which means someone in this conspiracy already suspected, or already knew, that you weren't the real target at all. They may have realized the switch before we did. The implications settled heavy in Alira's chest. If someone already knew about the switch, then whoever wanted Sarah dead might now be recalculating their entire plan, adjusting for a target who had changed shape entirely. And if that was true, then the danger circling the palace hadn't lessened at all. It had simply grown more patient, more precise, waiting for the right moment to strike again. They did not have long to wait. The attack came 3 nights later, during the formal ball held to celebrate the approaching wedding, a glittering affair of silk and candlelight that Alira moved through with her nerves stretched thin as wire, aware of Kale's presence nearby, even when he was speaking with someone else across the room, aware of Lady Rowan's watchful eyes finding her again and again throughout the evening, aware of the particular prickling sense that something was wrong long before anything visibly happened. It began with the candles. One by one, along the far wall of the ballroom, the flames guttered and died, not from any draft Alira could feel, but as though something had moved past them too quickly for the eye to track. The musicians faltered mid-song, sensing the shift in the room before understanding its cause, and then the first scream rang out from near the ballroom doors, high and sharp and immediately silenced. Chaos erupted. Guests surged away from the doors in a panicked crush, and Alira found herself pushed backward against a marble pillar, separated from Kale by a wall of fleeing bodies, her heart hammering as she searched the crowd for any sign of him. A hand closed around her arm, hard enough to bruise, and she was yanked sideways into the shadow of a side corridor before she could even cry out. Her attacker was fast, faster than any of the men from the carriage weeks before, and Alira understood, with a cold jolt of terror, that this was no ordinary soldier sent to intimidate her. This was something else entirely, something that moved through the dark corridor with an unnatural, gliding speed that made her stomach drop. "You should have died in that carriage," the attacker hissed, close enough that Alira could feel breath against her ear, cold and wrong. "Whoever you are, wearing her face, you've made this far more complicated than it needed to be." Alira fought, twisting hard against the grip on her arm, driving her elbow back into something solid enough to make her attacker grunt in pain, buying herself half a second of space before the hand found her throat instead, cutting off the scream rising in her chest. And then, suddenly, the pressure was gone, torn away with a violence that left Alira gasping against the corridor wall, and she looked up to see Kale standing over the crumpled shape of her attacker, his chest heaving, his gold eyes blazing with something far past anger, something closer to a wolf's fury given human shape. "Alira," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on her name, the first time she had heard anything but iron control from him. He crossed the distance between them in 2 strides, his hands finding her face, her shoulders, checking for injury with a desperation that told her, more clearly than any words could have, exactly how frightened he had been. "I'm all right," she managed, though her voice shook badly. "Kale, I'm all right." But he wasn't listening, not fully, some deeper instinct overriding his careful control entirely, and before Alira understood what was happening, he had pulled her against him, his mouth finding the curve of her neck and shoulder, and then a sharp, sudden pain bloomed there, gone almost as quickly as it came, replaced by a warmth that spread through her entire body like sunlight breaking through winter cloud. She understood, in the stunned silence that followed, exactly what had happened. She had heard the stories, half believed them the way one believes any old folk tale, stories of wolves who found their true mates and marked them in a moment of overwhelming instinct, a bond that could not be faked, could not be forced, could not be given to the wrong person no matter how desperately either party wished it otherwise. Cale pulled back from her slowly, his expression caught somewhere between wonder and horror, staring at her as though seeing her for the first time in an entirely new light. "That wasn't supposed to happen," he said, his voice rough, unsteady in a way she had never heard from him before. "That bond only forms with a true mate. It cannot be given to the wrong person, no matter what name they're wearing, no matter what lie stands between them and the truth." "What does that mean?" Alira whispered, though some deep, frightened part of her already understood exactly what it meant. "It means," Cale said slowly, staring at her like the ground beneath his careful, controlled life had just shifted entirely, "that whatever name you've been wearing, whatever lie brought you to my door, my wolf has decided, beyond any argument or objection, that you were always meant to be mine." Behind them, the sounds of the ballroom chaos were finally settling as guards restored order, but Alira barely registered any of it, standing frozen in the shadowed corridor with her hand pressed to the mark now burning warm against her skin, staring at a man who had just discovered, in the worst possible way, that the woman he had begun falling for was not the woman he had agreed to marry at all. The lie was no longer something she could carry quietly, waiting for the right moment to confess on her own terms. It had just been written permanently into her skin, in front of a man who now had every reason in the world to demand the full truth, and very little reason left to trust whatever answer she gave him. Word of the mark spread through the palace faster than any guard could contain it. By morning, servants whispered about it in the kitchens, advisors murmured about it in the corridors, and Lady Rowan arrived at the small private meeting Cale called with his closest council members, wearing an expression of triumphant vindication that made Alira's stomach turn the moment she walked into the room. "A bonding mark," Rowan said, before anyone else could speak, "given in a public ballroom, during chaos, without any formal ceremony, without any council approval. Tell me, my king, how does a man who has ruled with such careful control over every decision of state suddenly lose that same control entirely when it comes to his own bride?" "The mark is not something I chose to give," Cale said, his voice tight, controlled in a way that told Alira exactly how much effort the control was costing him. "It happened instinctively, in the middle of an attack, when I believed her life was in immediate danger. I did not plan it. I could not have prevented it." "And yet it happened," Rowan pressed. "Which means, according to every text on wolf bonding I have ever studied, that this woman is your true mate, not simply your political bride. Your true mate, chosen by instinct rather than treaty." She turned her sharp gaze toward Alira, something calculating moving behind her eyes. "Which raises an interesting question, doesn't it? If the marriage was arranged for political reasons, and the mark formed for reasons entirely separate from politics, then perhaps we should examine more closely whether the woman standing before us is truly who she claims to be." Alira felt the floor tilt beneath her, the careful ground she had been standing on for weeks finally beginning to crumble in full view of the people who could destroy her with a single accusation. She glanced at Cale, searching his expression for some sign of what he intended to do, whether he would protect the lie a little longer, or let it collapse entirely in front of the council that held the power to decide her fate. "The mark confirms nothing except that my wolf recognized something true in her," Cale said carefully, and Alira understood, with a rush of relief so sharp it nearly buckled her knees, that he had chosen, at least for now, to shield her. Whatever questions remain about the attack itself, and whoever arranged it, will be answered through proper investigation, not through baseless speculation dressed up as concern for the throne. Lady Rowan's mouth thinned, clearly unsatisfied, but she said nothing further, retreating instead into a watchful silence that felt, to Alira, far more dangerous than any open accusation could have been. The meeting ended without further incident, but Cale found Alira alone in the library that evening, his expression heavier than she had seen it since the night the truth first cracked open between them. "I protected you today," he said, without preamble, settling into the chair across from her with the weight of a man carrying far more than physical exhaustion. "But I don't know how much longer I can keep doing that without more of the truth. Rowan already suspects something. If she pieces together the rest before I understand it myself, this ends badly for both of us, and possibly for your sister as well." "I know," Alira said quietly. "Then tell me everything," Cale said. "Not the pieces you've given me so far, all of it. Who wants Sarah dead? Why? What she's involved in that made this threat necessary before you ever climbed into that carriage?" Alira closed her eyes for a long moment, gathering the courage to lay bare the last remaining pieces of a truth she had guarded so carefully for so long. "Sarah fell in love with a guard from our own house, years before your letter ever arrived," she said finally. "A man named Finn, Low-ranked, no family name worth mentioning in a marriage contract. She kept it secret because our parents would never have allowed it, and because the betrothal to you had already been arranged before she even met him, back when we were children and neither of us had any say in our own futures. That explains why she couldn't marry me, Cale said slowly. It doesn't explain why someone would pay assassins to kill her before the wedding, rather than simply exposing the affair and forcing a different resolution. I don't fully understand that part either, Alira admitted, but I've been thinking about it since the blackmailer's death, and I keep returning to the same suspicion. Whoever arranged the marriage between our houses may have had reasons beyond simple treaty politics. If Sarah's death served someone's purpose more than her marriage would have, then perhaps the entire alliance was designed from the beginning to fail in exactly this way, with the bride dead before the ceremony could bind our two houses together permanently. Cale went very still, something dark and calculating settling behind his gold eyes. You're suggesting someone within my own council arranged this marriage, specifically to have grounds to end it violently? I don't know, Alira said. I only know that the timing feels wrong. The attacks began before anyone outside our immediate family should have known Sarah was hiding a secret worth killing over. Someone close to this alliance, on either side, had reason to want her dead before she ever reached your gates. The silence that followed stretched long and heavy, both of them turning the implications over in their minds, and Alira watched Cale's expression shift through several stages of calculation before settling into something grim and resolved. Lady Rowan opposed this marriage from the beginning, he said slowly. Publicly, on the grounds that your family's house brought no strategic value to an alliance. But opposition and murder are very different things, and I need to understand which one we're actually dealing with before I accuse anyone of anything. What do we do now? Alira asked. We investigate quietly, Cale said, and you continue wearing your sister's name a little longer. Because the moment the truth becomes public, whoever arranged these attacks may feel emboldened to try again, believing the confusion of a scandal will cover whatever they attempt next. I would rather uncover the conspiracy while they still believe their secret is safe. Alira nodded, though something in her chest ached at the thought of continuing the lie even a moment longer than necessary, especially now, with the mark burning warm against her skin, and Cale looking at her with an expression that held far more warmth than suspicion despite everything he now knew. Cale, she said quietly, why haven't you sent me away already? You know the truth now. You know I'm not who I claim to be. Any other king would have had me executed by now, or at least imprisoned until the truth could be sorted out properly. He was quiet for a long moment, his gold eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her chest tighten. Because the mark doesn't lie, he said finally. Whatever name you've worn, whatever deception brought you to my door, something true recognized you the moment real danger threatened your life. I have spent my entire reign distrusting nearly everyone around me, weighing every alliance for its political value, rather than any genuine feeling. And then a woman wearing her sister's name walked into my life with a knife already at her throat, and some part of me that I didn't know still existed decided, instantly and without my permission, that protecting her mattered more than anything else in this entire kingdom. Alira's breath caught, the confession landing somewhere deep in her chest, alongside a warmth that frightened her almost as much as it comforted her. I never meant to make you feel that, she whispered. I only meant to save my sister. I know, Cale said. And that, more than anything else, is why I believe you deserve the chance to finish what you started, rather than being condemned for the shape it eventually took. He reached across the space between them, his hand finding hers, and Alira let him hold it, let herself believe, for one fragile moment, that perhaps the truth would not destroy everything after all. But somewhere in the palace she knew, Lady Rowan was already gathering evidence, already building a case that would soon become impossible to silence, and whatever peace Alira found in that quiet library moment would not last nearly as long as she needed it to. The summons came 5 days later, delivered by a palace guard with an expression carefully arranged into blankness, requesting Alira's presence before the full council within the hour. She knew, the moment she read the note, that something had gone wrong. Cale had warned her that quiet investigation carried risks, that Lady Rowan's suspicion, once fully formed, would not simply fade on its own. Still, the speed of the summons caught her off guard, and she dressed with trembling hands, aware that whatever waited in that council chamber would likely determine the rest of her life. The chamber was fuller than she expected, every council seat occupied, along with several faces she didn't recognize, minor lords and ladies who rarely attended formal sessions unless something significant demanded their presence. Cale sat at the head of the table, his expression carved from stone, giving nothing away, though Alira caught the faintest tightening around his eyes that told her he already knew what was coming. Lady Rowan stood as Alira entered, holding a folded document with the same careful precision General Colton had used weeks before, presenting evidence rather than simply making an accusation. 3 weeks ago, Rowan began, without preamble. A merchant traveling through the southern provinces reported selling wedding silks to a household matching the description of the Voss family estate. He remembers 2 identical daughters, twins, both present for the fitting, both trying on the very gown this woman wore to her own wedding announcement. She paused, letting the words settle over the room before continuing. I have since spoken with 3 other merchants and 2 former servants of the Voss estate, all of whom confirm the same detail. Sarah Voss has an identical twin sister, a sister who has not been seen publicly since the day the wedding party departed for the northern border. The room went utterly silent. Alira felt every eye in the chamber turn toward her, and she forced herself to stand still, spine straight, chin level, refusing to give them the satisfaction of watching her crumble before the accusation had even been fully spoken. I asked the council, Rowan continued, turning to address the room rather than Alira directly, to consider what we witnessed at the ball 5 nights ago, a bonding mark, given in a moment of chaos, to a woman who may not even be the bride our king actually contracted to marry. If this woman is not Sarah Voss, then the marriage agreement itself is void, the mark was given under false pretenses, and we have an impersonator standing in the very halls where our future queen was meant to live. Is this true? Asked an older lord Alira didn't recognize, his voice carrying easily through the silent chamber. Are you Sarah Voss, or are you not? Alira looked at Cale, one last searching glance, and found in his expression not fear or anger, but something steadier, something that looked almost like permission. He gave the smallest nod, barely perceptible, and Alira understood that he was telling her the moment had finally come, that there was no path left except forward, into the full truth, whatever it cost her. My name is Alira Voss, she said, and her voice carried clear and steady across the silent chamber, every word landing like a stone dropped into still water. Sarah is my twin sister. I took her place because she had already given her heart to another man before your letter ever arrived, and because the laws of this kingdom would have demanded her death for breaking a betrothal she never chose in the first place. I did not do this to deceive your king out of malice. I did it because I could not watch my sister die for loving someone she wasn't permitted to love. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the chamber, but Alira pressed on before anyone could interrupt, the truth pouring out of her now with a force that felt almost like relief, after weeks of careful, constant restraint. Since arriving here, I have been attacked twice, nearly killed by a wolf sent specifically to target me, and blackmailed by a man who was murdered the moment he became inconvenient to whoever arranged the original attempt on my sister's life. I believe someone within this very alliance wanted Sarah Voss dead before this marriage could ever be completed, and I believe that same person may still be sitting in this room today. The silence that followed was absolute, thick enough that Alira could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Lady Rowan's expression had shifted from triumphant to something more uncertain, clearly not having anticipated this particular turn in the conversation. That is a serious accusation, Rowan said finally, made without any evidence beyond your own claims. The evidence exists, Cale said, speaking for the first time since Alira had entered the chamber, his voice cutting through the tension with the weight of absolute authority. General Colton has spent the past week tracing the money used to hire the men who attacked the wedding carriage. That trail leads to an account controlled by a member of this very council, one who has consistently argued against this alliance from the moment it was proposed. Every eye in the room turned, following the direction of Cale's gaze, and Alira watched Lady Rowan's face drain of color as the full weight of the accusation settled directly onto her. That is absurd, Rowan said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. I oppose the marriage on political grounds. That is not the same as arranging murder. General Colton, Cale said, ignoring her protest entirely, present what you found. Colton stepped forward, unfolding a set of documents Alira hadn't seen before. Financial records and correspondence that had apparently taken days of careful, quiet investigation to assemble. The account used to pay the assassins traces back through 3 intermediary transactions to a holding registered under Lady Rowan's family estate, he said. In addition, a servant in her household confirmed, under careful questioning, that Lady Rowan expressed concern, weeks before the wedding party even departed, that the Voss alliance would strengthen the throne beyond what she considered acceptable for the balance of power among the northern houses. Lady Rowan's composure finally cracked, something desperate and cornered replacing her earlier confidence. I never intended for anyone to die, she said, her voice tight with something between anger and fear. I intended to disrupt the alliance, nothing more. The man I hired was meant to frighten the bride into fleeing, not to kill her. When he exceeded his instructions, I could not undo what had already begun, and silencing the loose threads became the only way to protect myself from exactly this moment. You ordered the wolf scent as well, Cale said, his voice gone cold and flat, the same tone Alira remembered from the night of the carriage attack, and the blackmailer's death. Rowan said nothing, which was, in its own way, confirmation enough. The chamber erupted into a flurry of voices, council members demanding explanations, guards moving to flank Lady Rowan's chair, and in the midst of the chaos, Alira found herself standing very still, watching the truth she had guarded so carefully finally collapse into the open, watching the woman responsible for weeks of terror finally exposed, and feeling, beneath the exhaustion and relief, a new and uncertain fear beginning to take root. Because her own truth was now equally exposed, laid bare before the entire council, and whatever mercy Cale had shown her in private held no guarantee against the judgment of a court that still, by every law written in this kingdom, had every right to demand her death for the impersonation she had committed. Cale rose from his seat, silencing the chamber with nothing more than the force of his presence, and turned to address the full council with an expression Alira had never seen on him before, something that looked almost like a challenge issued to anyone brave enough to argue against whatever he intended to say next. Lady Rowan will be held for formal judgment regarding the attacks on Alira Voss's life, he said. That matter is settled. What remains is the question of Alira Voss herself, and the law that technically demands punishment for impersonating a royal bride. He paused, his gold eyes sweeping the room before settling, finally, on Alira. I intend to argue that no such impersonation occurred in the way this council believes it did, and I intend to make that argument using evidence none of you can dispute. He crossed the chamber toward her, and Alira's heart climbed into her throat as he reached her side, his hand finding hers in front of the entire watching council, the bonding mark on her shoulder seeming to burn warmer beneath her collar as though responding to his nearness. The mark does not lie, he said, loud enough for the whole chamber to hear, and the mark chose her, fully, completely, regardless of whatever name she carried into this palace. I will not allow the law to condemn a woman my own wolf has already claimed as mate, and I would ask this council to consider very carefully whether they wish to test that resolve. The chamber fell into a stunned, uncertain silence, and Alira, standing beside him with her hand held fast in his, understood that the battle for her life had only just begun, shifting now from secret conspiracy to open legal challenge, with the entire weight of the throne's law standing against the truth of a bond neither of them had chosen. But neither of them, she realized with a rush of feeling too large to name, wished to undo. The council did not reach a decision that day, nor the day after. Instead, Alira found herself confined to her rooms under a form of gentle guard, neither prisoner nor free woman, while the full weight of the kingdom's law was debated by men and women who had never once looked her in the eye with anything resembling warmth. Edmund Hale visited her on the third day, his expression, for once, less clinical than usual, carrying with it something that might have been reluctant sympathy. The law is clear on impersonation of a royal bride, he said, settling into the chair across from her without invitation. Death, or exile at minimum, depending on the severity the council decides to assign. Your case complicates matters considerably, given the mark, given the circumstances that drove you to the deception in the first place, and given that the council has never before faced a situation quite like this one. What do you believe will happen? Alira asked, because she suspected Edmund Hale, of everyone in the palace, would give her the most honest answer available. He considered the question carefully before answering. I believe the king's argument regarding the bond carries real weight, he said. Marks are sacred in a way few other traditions in this kingdom still are, and no one wishes to be the council that argues against something considered divinely instinctive. But I also believe there are council members who fear the precedent this sets. The idea that a woman might impersonate a bride, survive long enough to form a bond, and escape punishment entirely because of it. They worry it invites exactly this kind of deception in future alliances. So my fate depends less on what I did, Alira said slowly, and more on which fear wins out among people who were never in that carriage, never faced that blade, never watched their sister cry over a love she wasn't permitted to keep. Politics rarely concerns itself with the truth of individual suffering, Edmund said, not unkindly. It concerns itself with precedent and power and the careful balance of both. He left soon after, and Alira sat alone with his words settling heavy in her chest, understanding fully, for the first time, just how fragile her position truly was, despite Cale's public declaration in the council chamber. A mark could be honored in sentiment and still overruled in law, if enough voices decided the risk to precedent outweighed the sentiment entirely. It was 2 days later, while while Alira paced the confines of her rooms, turning over every possible argument that might save her, that a commotion rose from the palace gates loud enough to carry even through her closed windows. She crossed to look outside, and felt her breath catch entirely at the sight of a familiar figure dismounting from a travel-worn horse in the courtyard below, dark hair escaping its careful braid, a face identical to her own turned upward toward the palace walls with an expression of fierce, desperate determination. Sarah had come. Alira was at the door before she fully registered moving, only to find it locked from the outside. A guard posted just beyond it who apologetically informed her that she was not permitted to leave her rooms without the king's direct order. She pressed her palms against the wood, straining to hear anything from the courtyard below, her heart pounding with a mixture of relief and terror so intense it nearly buckled her knees. Sarah had promised to stay hidden. Sarah had promised to let the sacrifice mean something. And now here she was, riding straight into the heart of the very danger Alira had spent weeks trying to shield her from. It was nearly an hour before the door finally opened, and Cale stepped inside first, his expression grave, followed a moment later by Sarah herself, travel-stained and exhausted but utterly resolute, the two sisters staring at each other across the small room with years of shared history, and weeks of separate terror passing silently between them. "You shouldn't have come," Alira said, the words breaking slightly as she crossed the room and pulled her sister into an embrace neither of them had expected to share again so soon. "I heard what happened," Sarah said, her voice muffled against Alira's shoulder. "Word travels faster than either of us accounted for. I heard about the attacks, the blackmail, the mark, and I heard that the council was debating whether to have you killed for a crime that was entirely mine to begin with. I couldn't let you carry that alone, not after everything you already carried for me." She pulled back, turning to face Cale directly, her chin lifted with the same stubborn determination Alira recognized from every argument they'd had as children. "I came to confess," Sarah said. "Whatever punishment your law demands for impersonating a bride belongs to me, not to my sister. I am the one who broke the betrothal by falling in love with someone else. I am the one who asked her to take my place. If someone must answer to your counsel, let it be me." "No," Alira said immediately, fear sharpening her voice. "Cale, please, don't let her." "I have no intention of executing either of you," Cale said, his voice calm despite the tension crackling through the room. "But the council will want to hear this confession directly, and I suspect it may actually work in both your favor rather than against it." He looked between the two sisters, something almost gentle entering his expression despite the gravity of the situation. A woman who broke her betrothal for love, and a sister who sacrificed her own safety rather than watch her die for it, tells a very different story than a simple impersonation for personal gain. The council responds to stories, whether they admit it or not. This one might actually move them. Sarah's confession before the full council 2 days later did exactly what Cale predicted. She stood before the same chamber that had nearly condemned her sister and told the truth without flinching. The story of a love she had never been permitted to choose, a betrothal arranged before she was old enough to understand what it would cost her, and a twin sister who had offered her own life and freedom rather than watch her die for a crime of the heart. The chamber, Alira noticed, listened differently to Sarah's confession than they had listened to her own. Perhaps it was the novelty of hearing both twins speak, confirming every detail against the other's account. Perhaps it was simply that a story of love and sacrifice, told twice over by two women willing to risk everything for each other, proved harder to dismiss than any single account could have been alone. Even Lady Rowan, brought forward briefly from her own confinement to answer additional questions about the conspiracy she had orchestrated, seemed to shrink slightly under the weight of the sisters' combined testimony, her earlier confidence entirely gone, replaced by the hollow resignation of someone who understood her own fate was already sealed regardless of what happened to anyone else in that chamber. "The council will deliberate," the eldest lord announced finally, once both sisters had finished speaking, "and render judgment within 3 days. 3 days. Alira thought of the 3 days the blackmailer had originally given her. The 3 days that had ended in a corridor with a mark burned into her skin, and a truth laid bare before a man she had never intended to fall for. She wondered, standing in that chamber with her sister's hand gripped tight in her own, and Cale watching from the head of the table with an expression she could not fully read, whether this next set of 3 days would end in triumph or tragedy, and whether the bond written permanently into her skin would prove strong enough to outweigh the law that still, on paper, demanded her death. The 3 days passed slower than any Alira had lived through since arriving at the palace, each hour stretched thin with waiting, with Sarah pacing beside her in the confines of their shared rooms, with Cale visiting each evening carrying news that told her nothing certain about which way the council's judgment would eventually fall. They're divided, he admitted, on the second night, sitting across from her with the particular weariness of a man who had spent the entire day arguing with people who valued precedent over people. Some believe the mark settles the matter entirely, that no law should override what a wolf's instinct has already decided. Others believe allowing the mark to excuse the deception sets a precedent too dangerous to permit, opening the door for any clever woman to impersonate her way into a bond and escape consequence entirely. And you, Alira asked quietly, what do you believe? I believe the law was never written with your circumstances in mind, Cale said. I believe a law that cannot account for love and sacrifice, and the particular desperation of trying to save someone you love from a fate they never chose, is a law worth challenging rather than simply obeying. But belief and power are not always the same thing, even for a king, and I cannot simply overrule the council on a matter this significant without giving them cause to question my judgment on matters far beyond this single case. Then what will you do? She asked, fear threading through her voice despite her best efforts to keep it steady. Cale reached for her hand, his thumb tracing slow, absent circles against her knuckles, a gesture that had become familiar in the weeks since the mark first bound them together. There is an old rite, he said slowly, rarely invoked, reserved for matters where the Alpha's own bond conflicts directly with written law. It allows the king to declare the mark itself as the deciding evidence in any dispute touching matters of the heart, overriding council precedent entirely, provided he is willing to stake his own authority on the truth of that bond. What happens if you invoke it, and you're wrong? Alira asked. What happens to you if the council decides you overstepped? They cannot remove a king for using a right written into the very foundation of this kingdom's law, Cale said. But they can, and likely will, use it against me politically for years to come, citing it as evidence of poor judgment whenever it suits them to undermine my authority on other matters. He met her eyes steadily. I have weighed that cost already, Alira. It is worth paying. She felt something in her chest crack open at the quiet certainty in his voice, the willingness to spend his own hard-won authority on a truth that belonged, fundamentally, to her. Cale, I can't ask you to risk that for me. You didn't ask, he said simply. I offered. There's a difference, and it matters more than you're giving it credit for. The council convened for final judgment on the morning of the third day, the chamber filled to capacity, word of the unusual case having spread far enough that minor lords from distant provinces had traveled in simply to witness the outcome. Alira stood beside Sarah near the center of the room, her hand gripped tight in her sister's, and watched Cale rise from his seat at the head of the table, with the same quiet, absolute authority she had come to recognize as entirely his own. Before this council renders judgment, he said, his voice carrying easily across the silent chamber, I invoke the Alpha's right of bonded truth, as recorded in the founding law of this kingdom, reserved for matters where the mark of a true bond stands in direct conflict with written precedent. A murmur swept through the chamber, several older lords exchanging glances that suggested they recognized the reference even if younger council members did not. The eldest lord, presiding over the session, inclined his head slowly. The right is recorded, he confirmed, though it has not been invoked in 3 generations. State your claim, my king, and this council will weigh it according to the law that grants you the privilege. My claim is this, Cale said. The bond formed between myself and Alira Voss was not given to a woman impersonating a bride for personal gain. It was given to a woman whose heart and courage proved worthy of it, regardless of the name circumstances forced her to wear. The law demanding punishment for impersonation exists to protect this throne from deception intended to harm it. Alira Voss's deception was intended, from its very first moment, to protect her sister from an unjust death, and to protect this alliance from collapsing entirely under the weight of a betrothal neither sister could fulfill honestly. I declare, by the right granted to me, that the mark itself stands as proof that no crime against this throne was ever truly committed, only a sacrifice made by a woman with more courage than this council has yet given her credit for. The silence that followed felt, to Alira, like the entire chamber holding its breath at once. She watched the council members exchange glances, watched the weight of Cale's declaration settle over the room, and understood that whatever happened next would be decided not by a vote, but by whether anyone present found the courage to challenge a right, so rarely invoked and so absolutely binding once claimed. No one did. The right stands, the eldest lord said finally, his voice carrying a note of something almost like relief, as though the chamber itself had been searching for a way out of a judgment none of them truly wished to render. Alira Voss is cleared of all charges related to impersonation, the marriage contract stands amended to reflect her true identity, and the bond between her and the king is recognized as legitimate under the founding law of this kingdom. The chamber erupted into a flurry of voices, some relieved, some clearly displeased, but Alira barely registered any of it, her knees nearly giving out beneath her as the full weight of the moment finally settled over her. Sarah's arms were around her almost instantly, both sisters shaking with relief neither of them had quite believed would come. Sarah Voss, the eldest lord continued, once the chamber had settled enough to hear him, is cleared of any wrongdoing regarding the broken betrothal, given the circumstances surrounding her sister's sacrifice, and the council's judgment that the original arrangement was never entered into freely to begin with. She is free to pursue whatever attachment she has already formed, without further consequence from this throne. Alira turned to find Sarah weeping openly now, relief and joy tangled together in a way that made Alira's own eyes burn with matching tears. Somewhere beyond the chamber walls, she knew, Finn was waiting, and for the first time since this entire ordeal began weeks ago, her sister would be able to walk toward him without fear shadowing every step. Lady Rowan's judgment came last, delivered with none of the mercy shown to the sisters, exile from the Northern Territories permanently, her lands and titles stripped, her name struck from every record of the council she had once sat upon with such confidence. She left the chamber under guard, her expression hollow, and Alira found she could summon little satisfaction in the sight, only a tired relief that the danger which had shadowed her every step since that first night in the carriage had finally, truly ended. Cale crossed the chamber to her once the council began to disperse, and Alira met him halfway, her hand finding his without thought, the mark on her shoulder warm beneath her collar in a way that felt, for the first time, entirely like relief rather than fear. "You risked everything for me," she said quietly. "I risked nothing I wasn't willing to lose," Cale said, "compared to what I would have lost if I'd let that council take you from me over a law written centuries before either of us existed to prove it wrong." He tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his gold eyes soft in a way she had never seen from him in public before. "Whatever comes next, Alira Voss, I intend to face it as myself, and I would very much like you to face it as yourself as well, rather than any name you felt you needed to borrow to survive it." "I'd like that too," Alira said, and for the first time since climbing into that ruined carriage weeks ago, she let herself believe, fully and without reservation, that the life waiting for her beyond this chamber might actually belong to her at last. The wedding, when it finally came, looked nothing like the ceremony Alira had once imagined dreading from the moment the invitation first arrived at her family's door weeks before. There was no fear in it this time, no borrowed name pressing heavy against her tongue, no careful calculation behind every word and gesture. She stood at the front of the great northern hall in a gown chosen for her own shoulders rather than her sister's, her true name spoken clearly by the officiant before the full gathered court, and felt, for the first time since this entire journey began, that every eye in the room was finally looking at the correct woman. Sarah stood beside her as the ceremony unfolded, radiant in a way Alira hadn't seen since they were children, Finn close behind her with an expression of quiet, disbelieving joy. The two of them finally permitted to stand together in public without fear shadowing the moment. The council had granted them a small holding near the eastern border, modest but entirely their own, a place where a former guard and a runaway bride could build a life neither of them had believed possible only months before. General Colton stood near the front of the gathered court as well, his usual watchful caution softened slightly by what Alira suspected, from the small nod he gave her as she passed, was genuine approval, hard-won and rare from a man who trusted almost no one easily. Nora stood beside him, grinning in a way entirely unbefitting her usual serious composure, and Edmund Hale observed the proceedings with his careful, clinical attention, though even he seemed, by the ceremony's end, to have softened into something resembling satisfaction with how the matter had ultimately resolved. Cale waited for her at the altar, with an expression Alira would carry with her for the rest of her life, something between wonder and certainty, as though he still could not quite believe the woman walking toward him had once been a stranger wearing someone else's name, and now stood before him entirely and only herself. "I once told you I didn't know what I believed about you," he murmured, low enough that only she could hear it as she reached him. "I know now. I believe you are the bravest woman I have ever met, and I believe my wolf understood that from the very first night, long before either of us had the courage to admit it." "I believe," Alira whispered back, "that I climbed into a carriage 3 months ago, expecting to disappear into a role I never wanted, and instead, I found the first place in my entire life where I was finally seen." The ceremony concluded with the traditional exchange the Northern Territories had practiced for generations, and when Cale leaned down to press his lips against hers, sealing the vows already written permanently into her skin, Alira felt the mark on her shoulder warm with a certainty that had nothing left to hide behind, and nothing left to fear. The following weeks brought their own quiet adjustments. Alira took to her new role with the same careful, sharp attention she had once used to survive a stranger's court, though now she wielded it openly rather than in secret, sitting beside Chaol during council sessions, offering opinions the older lords had learned, sometimes reluctantly, to respect. She visited Sarah and Finn at their small holding whenever the season allowed, the two sisters spending long afternoons exactly as they had as children, except now without any secret weighing down the conversation between them. Lady Rowan's exile passed into distant memory, referenced occasionally in council discussions as a cautionary tale rather than a lingering threat, and the northern territories settled, slowly, into a peace Alira had not believed possible on that first terrified night in the ruined carriage. It was nearly a year later, standing at the same window in the East Wing where she had first watched soldiers training in the yard below, that Alira found herself thinking back on the woman she had been when she arrived, quiet, invisible, certain that disappearing into her sister's shadow was the only role she had ever been suited for. That woman felt like someone else entirely now, a stranger she remembered with a distant kind of fondness rather than any real recognition. Chaol found her there, as he often did in quiet evening hours, slipping his arms around her from behind and resting his chin against the crown of her head, watching the same soldiers she had been watching, the same gray sky stretching endless beyond the palace walls. "Regrets?" he asked quietly, the same question he had asked her once before, in the earliest days of her deception, though the answer now carried none of the careful evasion it once had. "None," Alira said, leaning back into him, feeling the steady warmth of him at her back, solid and certain in a way nothing in her life had ever been before this. "I climbed into that carriage, terrified of becoming someone else's story instead of my own. I never imagined I'd end up exactly where I was always meant to be, simply by refusing to let my sister face her fear alone. Sarah would say the same about you," Chaol said, "that you never once let her carry her fear by herself, from the moment you were both children until now." "That's what sisters do," Alira said simply. "And what mates do," Chaol added, turning her gently to face him, his gold eyes warm in the fading evening light, is refuse to let each other carry anything alone, ever again, for as long as both of them draw breath. Alira smiled, rising onto her toes to press her lips against his. The bond between them settled now into something quiet and certain rather than urgent and unexplained, a truth neither of them needed to question any longer. Outside, the northern wind carried the first scent of coming spring across the training yards below, and somewhere beyond the palace walls, in a small holding near the eastern border, her sister was building a life finally free of fear. Alira Voss had come to this palace wearing a name that was never hers, prepared to disappear into a role built entirely around someone else's happiness. She left that fear behind in a ruined carriage on a cold northern road, and found, instead, exactly the life she had never known she was brave enough to want.